My name's Elizabeth Castelli. I'm the interim director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women. And I am delighted to welcome you to tonight's Natalie Boymel-Campen Memorial Lecture in Feminist Criticism and History. I also want to thank various people for their work in making this event possible. BCRW staff, especially Eve Kausch, Pam Phillips, and Avi Cummings. BCRW student research assistants, Asha Futterman and Tirza Anderson, who are at the back table with the ever adorable BCRW onesies that you must get for the babies in your lives. I want to thank events management, the AV staff, the caterers who have arranged a beautiful reception over here after the lecture, so stick around. And also the facility staff who make the space ready for us to have all of our events and to gather here tonight. I also want to mention that Myung is here from Word Up Community Bookshop, back in the back of the room, and has for sale 2 books by tonight's speaker, Black Feminist Archaeology, and a co-edited volume, W.B. Du Bois' Data Portraits Visualizing Black America. This is a very cool and beautiful book. This is a beautiful and smart book, and this is also smart and also extremely beautiful. So check them out at the back table and support your local community volunteer-run bookshop. Okay, tonight's lecture is the Natalie Boymel-Campen Memorial Lecture in Feminist Criticism and History. Tally, as everyone knew her, was a pioneering scholar of art history and gender. As a much-beloved member of Barnard's faculty from 1988 to 2009, Tally chaired women's studies for many years and established strong foundations for the current Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the college. She was the inaugural occupant of the Barbara Novak Chair in Art History at Barnard, as well as a valued member of the graduate faculty in art history at Columbia. An internationally recognized scholar, Tally's research focused on Roman art and architecture of the imperial period. Her work took place at the intersections of art history, archaeology, classical studies, and feminist theory. She was the author and editor of several books, including her last publication, Family Fictions in Roman Art. Tally passed away in 2012, but we keep her spirit in our midst by honoring her memory every year with a distinguished lecture delivered by a colleague working in one or more areas of her field of expertise. And I know that Tally would be extremely pleased that we have invited Whitney Battle-Baptiste to deliver this year's Campen Memorial Lecture, the first archaeologist to do so. And so now to tonight's lecture. Whitney Battle-Baptiste is associate professor in the Department of Anthropology and also the director of the W.E.B. Du Bois Center at UMass Amherst. She's a native of the Bronx, so she's a neighbor, and is also a scholar and activist who sees the campus and the classroom as spaces to engage contemporary issues with a sensibility of the past. Her academic training is in history and historical archaeology, and her research is primarily focused on how the intersections of race, gender, class, and sexuality look through an archaeological lens. Her research includes archaeological investigation at Andrew Jackson's Hermitage Plantation in Nashville, Tennessee, the Abiel Smith School on Beacon Hill in Boston, the W.E.B. Du Bois Boyhood Home Site in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and a community-based archaeology and heritage project at Miller's Plantation on the island of Eleuthera in the Bahamas. Her first book, Black Feminist Archaeology, outlines the basic tenets of Black feminist thought and research for archaeologists and shows how it can be used to improve contemporary historical archaeology as a whole. Her most recent work is an edited volume co-edited with Dr. Britt Ressert of the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies, and it's entitled W.E.B. Du Bois's Data Portraits Visualizing Black America. The lecture she's going to deliver to us tonight is entitled Moving Mountains and Liberating Dialogues, Creating a Black Feminist Archaeology. I hope you will join me in welcoming Professor Battle-Baptiste to the podium and to Barnard. Thank you.
I'm going to try to stay here because the mic is here. I want to move, but I'm not. Good evening. Let's try that again. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. That's an acknowledgement that you're here, I'm here, we're here together, and we see each other. Before I get started, I want to, acknowledge the peoples, the indigenous peoples that were here prior to, I live in Massachusetts, so prior to all of that Puritanism that came. And nations such as the Delaware, the Montauk, the Mohegan, and all of those nations to the north, the south, the east, and the west. So we have to give acknowledgement to those nations that were here. I also want to give acknowledgement to my ancestors, those whose names I know, those whose names I hope to learn one day, and those whose names I will never know. If it was not for them and their lives and their struggles, I would not be here today hanging out with you tonight. So, how are we this evening? Okay, I really need y'all to wake up. Come on now. Okay. I know this is an academic setting, and I know we must be academic, but there's no way I could have been a quote-unquote academic in the sense and write a book with those three words together, Black Feminist and Archaeology. So clearly I have pushed the envelope, and that's what I plan on doing this evening. So I need you to work with me, be with me, and understand that we can kind of go through this journey together, okay? Okay, there we go. Thank you for waking up. It's Monday, that daylight savings thing happened. Everybody's a little tired. It's like warm, but there's still snow on the ground. These are all the things that are happening in our lives right now. And we're not even gonna talk about politics, right? Okay. So I want to talk to you this evening very humbly, because this is not going to be a conversation about this is my life and this is what I did, be happy for me, etc. Because it might seem like that initially, but what I want to share with you is how the idea behind early African American lives, and I pause and hesitate when I say African American lives, because initially when I was a historian, because I left history and went to anthropology for many reasons, I wanted to know what happened after 1619. I just threw that in there as well because this is 2019, 400 years. We've been on this soil, both free and captive. So let's just say that, like Spike Lee said when he finally won that Oscar, it's been 400 years, okay? But I wanted to know about the early lives of my ancestors. And history was just not cutting it, right? I felt the archive was where I was gonna find it. I felt that if I dig deeper, myself, I'm going to find something that no other historian has found before. I think other historians feel that way too, but it's debatable whether that actually happens. But I really felt that, and from my very nurturing, happy place that was a historically Black college in Petersburg, Virginia, Virginia State University, I went down to Williamsburg and the College of William and Mary, because that was about early history, right? That's early American history, so I should be able to find out about African people, not so much. And it was a big culture shock to go from a historically Black college to the Harvard of the South. I don't know if you know that the College of William and Mary is called the Harvard of the South. Yeah, okay. I live in Massachusetts. That's not really a big deal to me. It's just a school in Cambridge. However, it wasn't cutting it for me. But at the same time, I was introduced to this thing called archaeology. And I wasn't sure that archaeology was gonna be the way that I was gonna go, but I knew somehow I wanted to know about what happened within the spaces of people's homes. Because I felt like in many ways, that is where we become ourselves. That is where we learn. That is where we shape and understand our identity initially before you go out in the world and you're told otherwise. And I'll get into what I mean by that. So I always have to, big up the Bronx. And also I'm a member of the hip hop generation, like the real hip hop generation. So that means I'm almost 50. and I look good for my age, thank you. But I'm saying this because it's important for me to kind of have those two factors in this conversation with you. One is because I am of the hip hop generation, so there's inflections in my academic speak that is reminiscent of hip hopness, okay? That was kind of a light note. I guess no one got that joke. But it also tells you, I want to mark that I grew up on the 16th floor of a 33-story building. So the idea of the domestic sphere for me was a little bit jaded. It was like, my floor. And I do want to say, and I do tell people, especially in the state of Massachusetts and other places where they think they have greenery, I say, I show this picture because I did grow up around trees. And look, there's a waterway, and this is actually, my building is actually one of those three taller ones in the middle there. So I did actually really grow up there. But also I said we have the Bronx Zoo, we have the Bronx Botanical Gardens. I went horseback riding as a child on the Dude Ranch that was on Pelham Parkway. I grew up with nature too. Okay. And I'm a 70s baby, so I had to give a shout out to my parents, But also, I had a little bit of like a detour, because my mom and my dad they didn't stay together, and my mom wanted to get her master's, and so she got her master's in Chinese studies, and she was a graduate student, and there was this exchange opportunity, so she and I, to Taiwan, because that's what you do, like in '69 when she graduated college, she went to Ghana because she had to make sure she, do I really want to live here? And then she said, well, maybe not. And then she came back, and then we went to Taiwan, and I don't know, maybe that's where my love for Du Bois and/or my communism is not completely evil, socialism is possible, came from, I don't know. But I did go to kindergarten in Taiwan. Don't ask me anything in Mandarin. I lost that language. But it's just to tell you that sometimes a little girl from the Bronx has a lot more going on than you think she does. But I want to get back to all of the things that are me, right? So no, I went to Taiwan, then we came back, and I grew up in this crazy community. Well, it's not crazy, that's not right, I'm sorry. Let me back up. Black nationalists, where Yoruba Lukumi practicing community right here in New York, by way of Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Manhattan, and Miami sometimes. And so I grew up around objects that defined who I was. I grew up around the idea that objects sometimes define aspects of your identity, as in things, as in tangible things. So the idea behind, and you can ask me about Lukumi Yoruba traditions if you want to, but that's not really the topic of this, but it's just to show you that there were ways in which archaeology was always kind of moving in and out of my life that I didn't necessarily understand completely as this practice of archaeology, because I was never exposed to it as a Black girl growing up in the Bronx that spoke Mandarin and only ate Chinese food until I was 8. So, okay. That's my family, because I'm just throwing up there because Black love does exist. Revolution, thank you. Okay, so really, that was very random. The idea behind why archaeology. So I really did not want my quest to understand what everyday lives kind of looked. How could I articulate the ways in which captive Africans, let me say that one more time, I don't say slave, I don't really even say enslaved. There's this thing that happened in this place called the New York City African Burial-Ground, and the community, along with archaeologists, the archaeologists that were about it, meaning Michael Blakey and the Howard team, actually came together to create that term that for them best described who these and what these, how we would describe, how would we name these ancestors. And we named, the name that came together was captive African. Because if you say, like when I used to give tours at the Hermitage where these pictures are from, I used to let people know that when you say someone is a slave, that becomes their identity, yeah? That's what they're born to do. If they're enslaved, they are first a human being, and the system of slavery is put upon them in some ways. So it covers their identity in ways that is involuntary. They don't have a choice in that. So to me, it's showing agency, but it's still taking a little bit away as far as it's not strong enough. The idea of captive African, if you think about it, and I usually say it and then I pause because it makes you think that these folks were captured, taken, and placed in the places that we are today and we've migrated to and around. So for me, it creates the imagery, and language is so important. Like folks who are escaping from Guatemala, they're not running away, they're not invading our country, they're undocumented and they're migrants, they are seeking asylum, right? Words and language are so important. Like the idea that I'm not a minority, haven't been a minority in years, I'm a part of the global majority, first of all, and I'm minoritized by others. I don't wake up in the morning and go, I'm a minority, I'm an other. No, we can talk about intersectionality and all that, but I'm talking specifically about the ways in which we are racialized and minoritized and all of the way, and I know I'm just making up words, but it's okay because I'm an academic. So the idea behind that kind of language and the threads that the language kind of pulls with it, the thoughts. Captive African to me creates the imagery that it wasn't voluntary. It's not something you're born to do. Today we have this thing called the talk, where we have to tell I have 2 sons. My 12-year-old son is the same height as I am. That's why I wear heels a lot, because I gotta, stay a little bit taller. But he's 12 years old. He's right now, in the eyes of whatever, he's a man, and he's a threat. So we have to have the talk. So please understand that that same talk in which we discuss today had to happen during slavery. You have to teach a child how to navigate slavery. It's not something that comes natural. And I want you to keep that in mind, put a pin in it, because we're going to talk about it directly in relationship to archaeology. So why archaeology? Because to me, this was tangible evidence of the existence of choice. It was the existence that material that could help us define who these captive folk were. And also, I don't use the word runaway, because runaway it kind of means like you did something wrong. No, it's escapee, because you are taking yourself and you are escaping. Okay, language. I'm an anthropologist, language. Okay, and I also show these slides because people sometimes don't believe I actually dig. I'm too old to dig now, I don't want to, but I did. Street cred right there. Okay, so also, this idea behind, and this woman in the photo is Anna Agby Davies, who is she was number 3. No, I was number 3. We'll talk about the PhDs in archaeology that are Black women. I was in the top 5, and so was she. That's how many of us there are. Maybe there's up to 10 now. Women. Altogether, Black folks with PhDs in archaeology, we're almost at 20. We're almost there. So please, we need some more folk. Okay, so I'm showing you some key kind of things that when I first started to get into this thing called Plantation Archaeology, which was the defining aspect of how archaeologists were interpreting the lives of captive people, right? So you've got the root cellar, which is, I got a pointer, hey. You got a root cellar here. Root cellars are subterranean storage pits. That sounds good, right? They're holes dug in the ground to keep your fruits or vegetables. In the summertime, it's in the ground. They stay cool. In the wintertime, these are usually by a hearth, so they stay warm and they don't freeze. This is storage, food storage for captive people, and they're usually found within the quarters in which folks are living. And so these were one of the markers, but everybody was in some ways using these subterranean, these dug-in ground pits. But however, if you find root cellars and you find a blue bead and you find a cowrie shell, these are things that together mean that captive Africans must have lived here. These are patterns that archaeologists are looking for, and I'm not, beating that up, but I'm just saying, to me, it wasn't just about the patterns. It was about the questions we were asking of the patterns. That's the part that I couldn't quite wrap my mind around. There was something that was missing for me. And that something was, what is that telling us about the folks? How does that kind of illuminate or help us to understand their struggles, their everyday life, and make them or insert them into the story and the history of the Plantation South? And so for me, it was about moving beyond patterns. My advisor, my dissertation advisor, this was a long time ago, also looked at the ways in which there were certain items that were probably purposely manipulated so that they were worn. They were worn to ward off shiny things like mirrors and crystals and things like that actually reflect. They reflect bad energy. It's not just an African thing, it's not just an African American thing. If you really want to keep people away, put a mirror on your door, it works. They either get distracted by their own beauty, or, I don't know, they forgot what they came to do and mess with you. And that you can put them in places and people don't even notice them, but it's reflecting the whole time. See, I'm giving you all kind of juju in my talk. But these kinds of patterns, I needed like something more. This was tangible evidence. It was important, but there was something else. Because for me, the idea behind the house, everything had to happen inside the house, right? Because we're looking at the patterns and we're looking at the ways in which these artifacts tell us a story, but yet we're missing the questions that I felt weren't being asked were actually about the family. And in the case of Andrew Jackson, the ceramics, you have to look at ceramics if you're a historical archaeologist. So here you go. And I worked at Colonial Williamsburg, so I had to put in a picture of, people, because it's a living history museum. So that's people dressed up as captive people. They kept trying to get me to do that while I was there. I never did. I'm just gonna move on from that. Okay, now we leave Colonial Williamsburg and we go to the man on your $20 bill, Andrew Jackson, one of the current, number 45's favorite president is this dude right here. I think the first month of his presidency, he went and laid a wreath on his grave. Didn't know that, did you? He did. And actually, here you go. This is a guitar-shaped driveway. He was the first, not the dude that lives in Memphis. Andrew Jackson was the first person to have, I don't know, this is what I heard, maybe Tennessean to have a guitar-shaped driveway. I don't know why that's important because I really, really do not like Elvis. But so the idea behind the household was something that was lacking in the interpretive process of these plantation studies. Because for me, the records show that families were kept together, right? You have the narrative of, have you ever heard the narrative of the good slave master? Benevolent. You can't be a good owner of human beings. However, the idea that families weren't separated, right? The fact that there was a very low infant mortality rate on this plantation, these were all kind of statistical evidence that life on this plantation wasn't that bad. This is some of the interpretation. And some of the archaeology was being used to try to figure out how to kind of be critical of that narrative. So the archaeology was in the right place. They were trying to look at the ways in which they could see a different narrative develop through the material, which is very hard to explain. But what happened was I had a problem with the idea of these structures that had just families living in them. I don't know anybody who doesn't have, like my children joke with me, and my youngest son said, "Mommy, do we have any friends that aren't an auntie?" And I'm like, no, you don't have any friends that are not an auntie. So that means we don't call grown-ups, children don't call grown-ups by their first name, so you put something in front of the name. I had to explain. Okay. But the idea of fictive kin, the ideas in which we interact not in nuclear family units. A nuclear family was happening in the Hermitage mansion. It wasn't happening with 95% of the population. Because these folks, do you know that, what I almost said Du Bois, I'm sorry. Andrew Jackson was known as the first common man president, right? He's the first one that wasn't of kind of United States aristocracy, whatever that means. So that's like the Washingtons, the Jeffersons, all those men that married well and became president, that story. But Jackson also married well. He married the daughter of the founder of Nashville. So clearly there's a pattern. How do you become president? You marry the right woman. Well, maybe not now, but okay. So this is the idea behind the First Hermitage was a place that was the original structure in which the Jacksons lived in was this. When they lived in this structure, it was 2 stories high. It was 2 stories high. We know that because architects actually looked at the ways in which the floor joists were actually ceiling beams. So we know architecturally that this structure was actually made into 1 story from 2, as well as the fact that the roof for this is way too large for a single story house. This structure right here is called a double pen, which means that it has 2 equally sized rooms. Each family would have lived in one of these 20 by 20 units. And we know from, I have it right here, sorry. I'm gonna get back to that in 1 second. So this is what I described as that First Hermitage house, also called the farmhouse. This is the kitchen quarter, so they would have a unit here and a unit here. We know archaeologically that we had a unit here that was also double pen, and we had a remnants, but we can never find the entire structure. So we just made that. Do you feel like you're doing archaeology right now? Did I lose you? Okay, I'm just checking. Because this is where I want you to bring back that idea of everybody being in one household. There's no way to be within a captive community and be in a nuclear family structure, especially with the constant threat and/or, even if the literature says that Jackson never sold people away, there's still inconsistencies in the fact that there was a mother, a father, and children. That doesn't take into account that anybody in the past was ever queer identifying, and we know they were. It also doesn't take into account the way in which families are altered based on occupation, based on the needs, based on being hired out, based on dying, based on being sick. All of these things happening means that the family structure is not this nuclear family structure. It is a communal space, and this is what I mean. This area right here is fire pit here, but it's also the mansion, the newly built mansion is down here where you can't see it. This south cabin right here is blocking the view from the backyard of the mansion to this fire pit. Is that important? Jackson and nobody else could see what was happening at the fire pit. This is the areas between the 2 cabins. I actually skipped a part. Jackson lived in the farmhouse, the 2-story house, then because he became big and all, he had to have like a real mansion because he had to be a gentleman planter. Didn't plant anything ever in his life, but was still called a gentleman planter before he moved to DC to become the president. So he built this huge, the picture you saw with the guitar-shaped driveway, he built a mansion. It looked like there were marble beams, but he was really cheap, so they were actually, whatever the structure was, and they were painted to look like marble. The stuff he had inside, everything was painted, everything was faux, way before it was popular. So when he did that, this was for some reason dropped down to one story. And this whole area became known as the middle quarter, because it was between the house itself and the fields further, about 250 yards further that way. So the reason why I say that is because in this area, at first, when Jackson lived here, there were captive people here when he first moved here in the early times, right? So he didn't have a lot of people. He had maybe about 25 captive people. Eventually, when he died, he had over, probably upwards of 200 people and over 1,000 acres. Nothing about that is common man, and nothing about that is regular, because no one had, the average in Nashville and surrounding areas of people who owned plantations was about 5 captive people. He had almost 200. So this area between these two cabins, I really thought that the whole key to everything, especially my dissertation, was going to be in this area. It wasn't. But what was noticeable is that there were no artifacts. There were absolutely no artifacts. And that's when you begin to go, oh, as an archaeologist, I have to be intellectual, and I have to say the absence of artifacts is just as important as the presence of artifacts. And it was, because what we found here was the yard was swept so much that it was a hard clay, almost like concrete. And you could tell where the courtyard area was. So that's one thing, because I became obsessed with sweeping yards, and I wrote articles about sweeping yards, and sweeping yards was everything, and it was the ritual, and it was so African. And then I spoke to my grandmother, and I was like, did you sweep the yard? Because you grew up in Virginia. And she was like, yes. And I was like, but it was the ritual, and you were sweeping the spirits away. And she was like, it was a chore that we did because we had no grass and we were barefoot. You need to just calm down. So that's what happens when you read too much sometimes. Okay, and you need those people in your life to bring you back to reality. And so I also show this because I dig. So this area right here was a space that we could not understand. We had layer after layer after layer of ash. And I'm like, it must be from this big chimney right here. They must just be dumping this ash out, and that's it. But what happened was, as in all archaeological sites, it was the last day of the last season, and we were trying to do as much digging as we could before we closed this space up and never went back again. And then we find this. And we call it a barbecue pit because, first of all, it's Nashville. Right, barbecue. I mean, my family's from North Carolina, so it's a different kind of barbecue. And also, this is why I feel compelled to acknowledge ancestors. Because even if we didn't know what this was, the clay at the bottom was not just swept, it was burnt. There was a piece of and I don't have pictures of it, my apologies, it was a long time ago. There was a tuning fork, a fork at the bottom that was broken, as well as a half of a pig skull. So I said, if I didn't know any better, and I was just starting out as an archaeologist, I can make that leap of faith and say, I'm pretty sure they're cooking something in here, like pig. So I said, thank you to the ancestors. I appreciate that information. I didn't appreciate it on the last day of the last season while we're trying to close this up. And literally one brick came, and then the next brick, and the next, and it was ridiculous. So going back to that picture, this right here is where that barbecue pit is. That barbecue pit is out of the sight of the mansion. So again, remember the idea of the talk, right? These are just some of the artifacts that were found. We found fishing hooks, we found thimbles, we found a domino part. So we find games, we're finding a mouth harp, we're finding things that identify quote unquote gender, right? So there's not one gender that is using this space and losing things. This is not a woman's space, this is not a man's space, this is a communal space where I would argue, and I'm taking a leap of faith and I'm just doing it, that this is a space in which those kinds of ideals, those kinds of talks that had to happen for children to be able to navigate the system of captivity have to learn. You have to do it somewhere. And you're not going to do it in the confines of a 20 by 20 foot unit when there's a low infant mortality rate. Remember I said that? That means that families are between 6 and 8 people per family. Anything you could possibly do outside of that 20 by 20 foot structure, you are going to do. And one of those things that you can do is actually be in that same space that is safe from the eyes of the one who owns you. That wasn't profound enough. Okay, sorry. And I had this, just like I had the Colonial Williamsburg one. Roots Christmas was taped at this site. But none of these things are actually there. These were all movie set. I just roots. Okay, and I'm gonna go through quick because I feel like I'm running out of time. So this was the one and only Hermitage slave descendant organization meeting in which people came to acknowledge, this was in the year 2000, they came to acknowledge they were descendants of the captives who lived in this space. And on this side, you have folks that were there and were happy to be a part of it. But then here you have folks that were pouring libations, saying the names of their ancestors, drumming. They happened to also be Yoruba Lukumi folks from Atlanta. So it was interesting because I was like, yes, please do it over here so that the ancestors can help me figure out what's what. And it worked, I'm just saying. Folks were here like, I don't know what they're doing, but whatever it is, it's happy. Okay, I'm gonna slide through Eleuthera and then talk about what I'm doing now and then open up for question and answer, because I could talk forever. Okay, Eleuthera means Isle of Freedom. It's in the Bahamas, it's a family island. It's the closest island to Cuba. Long story short, it was a plantation, about 2,000 acres, and it was loyalists that came from South Carolina, and they were still down with the British, and they had a certain amount of time to leave the Americas after 1776. So the British government gave land to these loyalists in Trinidad, Jamaica, and all over the Bahamas. And this was one of the plantations where they tried to come and literally transplant their South Carolina plantation onto this Eleutheran island and grow cotton. It didn't work. And so like everyone, they just went to Nassau. Everyone just goes to Nassau. That's a whole nother story. But so what happened is after the final descendant who had no children, she was forced to do something after freedom. In 1834, British slavery ended. She had to do something with the folks who lived on this plantation that she literally just left there and moved to Nassau. And so what happened is she gave 4 or 5 families, she gave them all rights to the land forever and ever. And now there's structures that are there. They want to do archaeology, but there's really no way to dig. It's really on rock. But archaeology as a way to collect oral history, archaeology through the lens of archaeology, through materialism, material culture, materialism, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that, that's a bad word, materiality, and the ideas behind what we would love to see, but we can talk about the structures, the above ground kind of archaeology. And I say I'm moving through this quickly because it's in a new stage. One of my graduate students just finished her PhD and did an amazing job with bringing together the oral histories and actually sharing on the island, the stories of this particular plantation. And this is just stuff on the surface. You just walk and there's just artifacts everywhere. And but also the oral history and the ideas behind talking to people about what they want to see in how to memorialize it, and all this was great. And then about 5 months ago, Disney bought a big swath of the land, and so now my role has changed, so I have to go down there and try to figure out how to help to navigate how the community's interest may or may not be represented in the ways in which Disney will make port, not a port, like a cruise ship port, right? I'm not gonna talk about cruise ships or Disney. I don't wanna get sued, okay. Not yet. So I feel like Eleuthera for me, like, again, it was how do I bring those ideas that I use in the archaeology that I do, how do I bring that conversation into a space like Eleuthera? I'm not Bahamian, I'm African American, I know that I'm not Bahamian. The politics of race there are very different. I am not constantly in negotiation with tourism. You cannot fight tourism. Tourism, once it's settled in, it's got its hooks. Like, I don't want people to go to Paradise Island, but I know that if 60% of the Bahamian nation is employed by Atlantis, I don't want to see Atlantis fail, because then the country would not be doing well. But at the same time, how do you figure out how do we create cultural heritage that is not just worth saving in the sense, but that is acknowledged as an important part of the culture, of the conversation, of the history, especially when once you, on the island right now, are elders and very, very young people. Everybody else has to go to work someplace else, usually Nassau. And so all of these complexities, for me, is what kind of contemporary archaeological practice does. It thinks about the current situation. Why are 1 in 4 women on this island diagnosed with breast cancer? That's not an archaeological question, but it's a question that concerns the community. It's a question that I can't avoid when I'm in conversations about the history of the island. To me, it's a part of the ways in which their stories become incorporated from the present to the past, and then what they want for the future. So there's a lot going on, and this is a space in which it's a difficult thing to navigate, and I'm willing to do it as an archaeologist. But the idea of me just digging and finding the artifacts to prove that this stuff is historically significant is not what the role is at this point. At this point, it is to also ensure that Disney understands that the community is invested in making sure that the cultural heritage that they want to see preserved does get preserved. Those questions. And that's me contemplating, because that's what we do. And these are some of the folks that we work with on a regular basis, and that's the newly minted Dr. Sesma. I'm gonna move on. So I want to talk about two really quick projects in which it's really interesting. I'm hearing drums, that's so amazing. And I know we're competing with that downstairs. I appreciate that, thank you. Thank you, ancestors, oh, that's beautiful. But what I wanted to say is, as an archaeologist that's engaging in contemporary practice, Black materiality is so entrenched in the ways in which we understand and see each other. So for me, I've always been intrigued by museums, but was always afraid to kind of engage in those conversations, because I'm an archaeologist. I'm supposed to be engaged in dirt, right? And artifacts, and then reinterpreting the same artifacts 5 times after 5 other people have, because I'm taking them off the shelf and I'm reinterpreting them. Well, I took on this challenge. An artist by the name of Senga Nagudi, back in, she was a major artist out of California, and she was in the Black arts movement, but she was kind of on the cusp of radical women's art, as well as the Black arts movement, which was very masculine. So she was always kind of caught in the middle, and she had a new a new awakening of her work in the last 5 years. So there was an art exhibit happening at the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds, UK, and they asked me, well, Miss Nagudi wants you to write a piece about her art exhibit. And I was like, what? I'm an archaeologist, I don't do that. Well, her art is painful. She looks at the ways, especially centers on the contortedness of Black women's bodies. And she uses pantyhose, which, if you've ever worn them, you know you don't want to wear them. But it's it's the pulling and the pulling and the pushing and the shaping and she started this using this medium after the birth of her son, where she saw her body move in ways she never thought possible. And so this was her art, and then I wanted to write about this from the perspective of an archaeologist that understands this material speaks to me directly, because it's painful to see it, and it's painful to think about. I wake up some days and I feel like my back feels like that, because all of the ways that I'm contorted and the expectations that I have, and it's not necessarily pantyhose, and it's not necessarily, it's the embodiment of who I am. And in some ways, this is the embodiment of my relationship with archaeology, because I am constantly trying to navigate archaeologists taking me seriously. And I say that out loud, and I've been in my job for 12 years, I'm good. But it's the idea that I can call out the discrepancies, the fact that, no, I never got a bad review on my book, but that doesn't mean that people didn't like it, right? They never said it to my face. They never published the negative thing. And I think about how few Black women archaeologists are navigating becoming full professors or getting the major awards in our field. Why is that? And so for me, it's like I'm going to push myself, because I'm going to hope that archaeologists understand that contemporary archaeology means that we as archaeologists should engage in the present. Because if we don't, we're not actually going to survive as a field. I mean, that's just my opinion. I'm radical. So that was one piece. And right now, I'm actually working on a piece that is very, very difficult. This is a picture of Sandra Bland. And the piece that I'm working on is the material of her death. And I was asked to do this. It's a volume that we're pulling together. And it was like, because I'm one of the things that I'm doing is I'm looking at the materiality of state-sanctioned death, right? I'm looking at the ways in which it's the object that's blamed for the encounter and not the body, not the Black body, right? So Trayvon Martin is threatening because of his hoodie, not his person. Sandra Bland fails to pull over or fails to signal when she pulls over. And I had my students recently read an amazing poet by the name of Simone John, who her book is called Testify, and half of it is about Trayvon Martin and half of it is about Sandra Bland. And she actually has the transcript of the exchange between Officer Encina and Sandra Bland. When you read it, it's more haunting than actually visually seeing it. I will light you up. Get out of the, and so and then to hear him calling his superior and say, I don't know why they act like this. I tried to de-escalate it. I tried. I've got a situation. I've tried. And so in that, I'm thinking about the cell. I'm thinking about the fact that there's no camera. I'm thinking about the plastic bag in which she supposedly took her life. I'm thinking about her shoes, what she was wearing, where was the bed, where was the garbage can, all of these things. And I'm talking about it in the sense that the object is to be blamed for the death, not anti-Blackness. So when I say I'm moving in a place that is, this for me is the logical place in which Black feminist archaeology is taking me. It is engaging with contemporary archaeological practice. It's not to say that I'm giving up on the artifact. I'm actually going to do something this summer where we're digging in the dirt, and so I do still dig with community, but at the same time, for me, if there's not a way in which I can engage people who are living about the past, then I feel like I'm not really doing the work that I set out to do when I started. And so I'm gonna end, I swear, with this story. So in the second chapter, the chapter on Lucy Foster was something that I wanted to reinterpret, because in archaeology classes and seminars when I first started doing archaeology, I heard about Black Lucy's garden. And I was like, Black Lucy's garden? Who is calling her Black Lucy? That is ridiculous. And it was the first African-American historical archaeology site ever excavated by Adelaide and Ripley Bullen in 1941, 1942. Lucy Foster was born into slavery, was freed, had an acre of land with a house on it, and she had a cow. It was in the records. And she lived until she passed away. They did archaeology. She had an amazing array of artifacts, plates and dishes and cups and things that she should not have had, right? Like, they couldn't explain what it was because they were still looking for the patterns that were similar to that of a southern plantation, and this is Andover, Massachusetts. So I got an email about 2-3 weeks ago. There's a class from a all-girls private school, a very small school in Waltham, Massachusetts. And these students they did a bunch of research on Lucy Foster. They read my chapter, and I'm going to go hang out with them probably later this month. But what they're doing is they have located approximately where Lucy Foster was buried. And these girls have taken it on because they feel like Lucy Foster is a part of Andover history, and she's not there. There's no presence of her. There's no material remains there's no material marker for her. So they raised money and they did their research, and they're going to erect a gravestone for her in the cemetery where she was. And this is where they believe that her body was buried. And for me, it was, when I first got the email, it sent chills down my spine because I wrote about Lucy Foster because I wanted to redeem her. I wanted to give her a name, not have her be forever known as Black Lucy in some garden. I don't even know where the garden came from, but I knew that I wanted to do this for her, and it was something that was important to me as a Black feminist archaeologist. And so it's coming full circle, and Lucy Foster will have a grave marker about where she's buried, and she will forever be a part of Andover history, and hopefully at some point Massachusetts history. And so I just wanted to end with that. And I just like to end with this picture because this is me after I gave a talk in Sao Paulo, Brazil. No, was this Sao? Yes, in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And for me, it was a moment where I realized that there's a lot of work to be done when you put those three words together. That's Black, that's feminist, and that's archaeology. All of these things are possible, and it's true here, it's true in the global South, and it's true throughout the diaspora. It's not just you have to be a Black woman to identify with it. You have to understand that the conversation is about asking different questions and then thinking about citing other resources, #cite Black women, and thinking about how Black women should be a part of the conversation overall. Thank you.
So how do you feel some of the materials you've seen and examined, me over here,
Oh, sorry.
inform you in terms of maybe evolving your perspective on feminism, certain things you've seen through excavation or examining artifacts? How has it sort of over the years evolved your perspective on feminism and how these women lived their feminism in their time?
It's interesting because the fact that I call myself a Black feminist, when I wrote my dissertation, I didn't call myself a Black feminist. I was still a womanist and sometimes an Africana womanist. But I realized that the idea behind gendering artifacts were, I don't know how to field that question. I'm trying to, over time, I think that the ways in which I interpret spaces are not, it's not these binaries are difficult for me to play. I know men that sew. So if I find needles, does that necessarily mean that these are women sewing? Or the idea of guns and gun parts and fishing hooks are masculine. And these are, I think I was guilty of that as well, in terms of trying to place the idea of hunting with men. And over time, I realized in very similar ways that I'm trying to complicate the idea of the nuclear family, like everything is happening in one space. And I'm talking about the communalness of this outdoor cooking area. I need to talk about the communalness of the objects that are related to the tasks that people are doing. People are doing tasks to complete them, not to bolster their gender identity. I think in the sense of captivity. That's the way I see it happening. I think that the ways in which one has to balance is directly related to getting things done, not survival mode, but just getting things done. And so I think that I don't have to prove that there are women's artifacts, there are children's artifacts, there are men's artifacts, and then here is an example of the ways in which everybody is using this space at the same time. I think now I look at it as this is still a communal space, but it's a communal space because of the volume. It's because of my identifying the fact that there's a lot of activity going on in this particular place because of the volume of artifacts versus the lack of artifacts over there. So I think, I don't know if that answered your question, but I think at one time when I first started, I looked at them as gendered artifacts. Even though I was trying to write against it, I still understood that, or I was still trying to explain this communal thing by saying that these artifacts are masculine and they're here with women's artifacts, and I don't necessarily think like that anymore. I think of them as communal spaces in which tasks are being done. Okay.
Hi. So in some of your earlier work, you interacted a lot, engaged and honored the descendants of the captive people who had lived there, and with your contemporary archaeology, you're grappling with the memory of Sandra Bland, a real person whose real current relatives who knew her are currently living. Can you talk a little bit about the difference in interacting with families?
Yeah, I think that I have, in trying to understand how to write in academic speak, right? You have to kind of contextualize the moment, right? So you have to contextualize the idea of like police brutality or state sanction. Where does the breakdown between communities and office? When did it stop becoming protect and serve and police? Like, so where are these junctures, or where are these breakdowns happening? And in that sense, I'm still, although I'm a recovering historian, I still have to historically kind of contextualize the way in which these things aren't coming out of nowhere, right? They are, but also I'm in a world where I live, where I work 3 stories down from the Du Bois papers, and these rabbit holes you go down when you're looking for one answer and you find 15 other answers, so you never finish the article. But I think that for me, the Sandra Bland movement is still alive, and it is. At some point I'm going to, not for this article, but at some point I'm going to interact with her sisters and her mom and try to kind of have a conversation around what this means. Just like the piece I wrote about Senga Ngudi, I wrote it and it took so much to write and it was so painful. And I felt like I was like writing in some alternate universe. It just didn't sound like my voice, but it was what I needed to use the voice for that. And then I turned it in, of course late, it was way past the deadline. But I turned it in, and then I realized as soon as I pressed send, I was like, oh my gosh, she's still alive. Like, she's gonna read this. Ooh, did I get it right? Like, did I insult her? Like, how did I? And so, she loved it, because I didn't hear back from 2 weeks, and I was like, I messed up. I don't know how, because I don't write like this. I don't, and so apparently she liked it so much, she slept with it under her pillow that night, because she said that no one had ever captured it. She said, but there was 2 mistakes. I lived in Manhattan, not Brooklyn. I was like, okay, I'll fix that. But that to me was something that I wasn't used to, because I'm writing about sweeping yards and Andrew Jackson's Plantation, and I'm making these bold statements, and these people are not here to tell me, no, Whitney, that's not what happened. And so that is challenging, but when I talk about the kind of materiality behind the violence and the pain and stuff like that, is when people are like, as an archaeologist, how is that? We don't really see that. And I think maybe it's been I've been hanging out with too many Europeans, and so there's a lot of like contemporary archaeology in England, and so when I interact with them, I'm realizing that this is where I want to go with this stuff, and it's okay. It's okay for me to delve into theory I thought I would never delve into theory and be very theory, because I'm down to earth, I'm cool, But in terms of trying to explain and navigate these really large concepts, it was something that I just was naturally attracted to, just like the archaeology itself. And I think that I still engage with the material culture, I still engage with the artifact itself, but for me, the artifact has to be made accessible. Right? So if there's artifacts on the shelf, I'm pulling them down, I'm taking pictures of them, and I'm putting them online. Like, you all should know what artifacts look like, how you can incorporate artifacts into your curriculum, that's kind of the stuff that to me, that's also contemporary archaeology. It is telling people that we love this thing, right? This phone thing. This is material culture. This is an extension for many of my students. I've never seen them without one. And I say, well, what does this say about you? What does the stickers on the back of your laptop say about you? We do all these material culture exercises, and I'm going, look, you all just did archaeology. And they're like, really? And I'm like, yeah, that's what it's the materiality. It's the things that you wear that put you in a group or identify you with some, like if I see you wearing this or I see you wearing that, then that means, with me, it could change, because my hair changes like every 2 weeks, but it's my hair, I bought it, so. Yes, right, thank you. The material culture of hair. That's the next book, no, I'm kidding.
You mentioned being a Black female archaeologist, like struggling to be taken seriously sometimes. I'm curious to know, like, what has been the greatest obstacle that you've faced or have had to overcome in your career up until now?
I'm not archaeological enough. When I write, I don't include enough data. Some of the material that I write is not exactly archaeology. So these are some of the critiques that I have heard out loud. Like, for me, I read archaeological text, I understand it, I get it, I understand minimum vessel counts, and I know that a unit, I know what a unit is, and I know how to dig one, and I know how to measure one. But for me, when I first wrote Black Feminist Archaeology, that conversation I had with my grandmother about me taking myself too seriously and making her somebody that was engaged in ritual, and she was like, that's not what I was doing. I wanted to write a book that people who are not interested in archaeology would read. And I took a chance. I took a chance because it wasn't data heavy. It wasn't going to be picture after picture and chart after chart of all of the data that I had, but it was looking at the ways in which archaeology could be translated for people who I thought would benefit from the practice and the interpretation that comes from it. And I think in some ways, when I say not take me seriously, I say that kind of in jest. I think they take me seriously. I just think that I cause ripples, and I feel like there's some ways in which folks don't confront me about it because then, dare I say it, if they confront me as a Black woman that's an archaeologist, then they might be considered to be racist. You understand what I mean? Like, you can't shut me down because I'm one of the few and I'm saying this and I'm talking this, but it's really not to push an agenda forward. It's actually to open up the conversation so that we're not only reading other archaeologists. So I think that for me, the challenge is trying to balance that and still call myself an archaeologist and be okay with calling myself an archaeologist and still standing I'm not gonna say stand your ground because that's not a good thing, 2 feet on the ground and still be able to like matrix it, I don't know, like, you know, be able to move and navigate it, but still understand that discipline-wise, I am an archaeologist and I want to be considered an archaeologist. The other challenge is that I want archaeologists to be a part of Black studies, Africana studies, African American studies. I want us to consider materiality. I want us to consider the ways in which consumption and capitalism and economic injustice is directly tied to social and racial injustice. Now I'm talking Du Bois, sorry.
Thank you. I had a few questions. One, in what ways do you feel like you in the space of archaeology is a disruption? Have you, I'm sure you have, made connections between archaeology, anthropology, and how it was created from a Eurocentric lens to study the other anyway? And 3, how do you juggle being so passionate and still be a mother and all these other things? I'm a super busy woman. I don't know how to do it. Thank you.
I feel like starting with anthropology is, I started out in history, right? So I thought that, and I'm gonna be honest, when I graduated Virginia State, I got into the College of William and Mary, and they had this great summer internship program. So I took it. You know, it was a free ride. It wasn't free. There was a lot of pain involved in getting through that program. But I got the historical archaeology apprenticeship. So the summer before I started my courses, I was actually at Maria Franklin, who became my advisor. I was working on her dissertation site, Rich Neck Plantation. And I got this TA-ship, right? I'm like fresh out of undergrad. I had never dug, but I didn't know what archaeology was. But I knew this was paying for my master's, so But it was like I was a TA, which means a teaching assistant. Like I'm supposed to be teaching undergrads coming in to learn this. And so I think Maria gave me 3 days. And she gave me the basic, was like, now you're an archaeologist. And I was like, whoa, another Black woman. And in digging, I was like, for some reason, I was like, and finding things, I was like, this is the tangible that I need. It was like something that felt right because I was trying to do history and I was trying to do traditional early African American history, and it was these tangible things that I was touching and holding, and then reading about the emergence of, it was at the moment that where Plantation Archaeology became African American Archaeology. And I'm telling you this story because while I was there with 5 other Black women who were doing archaeology. And I thought that's what archaeology was. It's not. And it was insular. It was like I went from a historically Black college to like the HBCU of archaeology. And then everybody went about their business, and then I was at the College of William and Mary, and I was like, whoa, this is not cool. You know, I don't really like these classes. And then I went to do archaeology at the Hermitage, and I was it. It was only me. And then I was interacting with other archaeologists who had no training in African American anything. And I was like, if this was Greece, I think you would have done your research on to contextualize what you're doing. But the taking for granted that digging on a plantation is just you're from the United States, so you're going to know what it is, was something that spurred in me the fact that I had to disrupt it. I just didn't know how I was going to do it. And to me, anthropology is one of the most evil disciplines. And I don't want to redeem it, but yeah, I'm just trying to disrupt it. And I feel like for me, archaeology is something that I can disrupt at least archaeology with. Anthropology is a whole. I have nothing for that. I think that's a larger. Yeah, I'm too tired to do anthropology, so I think archaeology. But it was the idea that I didn't realize that archaeology did not look like me, which was, I guess it was ignorance was bliss. And then I got in the real world and was like, oh, no one else is like me. And no one else actually knows, has the background. And then when I finished my PhD and I got to Cornell, I'm in Africana Studies, like, yeah, let's do this. And they're like, what do you do again? So I'm in Black Studies, and they're like, I don't know archaeology, how that's colonialist. I'm not really getting with, I don't know why you do that. And so for me, yeah, I'm trying to disrupt both. It's just going to take a long time. I have a partner. Real talk. I couldn't have done it. And yeah. And my mom is near. It takes a village. We said that, by the way. Yeah.
I arrived a bit late, but I would like to know, what is your most important archaeological find?
For me, it is the things that are changed and manipulated by people, right? So the difference between an artifact and an object can be anything, but an artifact is supposed to be manipulated and changed by humans, or it's just changed. The reason why I say that is because for me, it was the scapula bone, which is the shoulder bone to a cow. And we found the scapula bone, and then we found the holes in the scapula bone, and then we found the buttons that were kind of shaped from that. And to me, it reminded me of my grandmother saying they used everything. They used things, the idea that chandeliers from the Jackson Mansion dining room are all the way out in the cabins in the field because somebody needed a crystal. And so thinking about the ways in which material moves from place to place, right? Every plate isn't a hand-me-down. Some plates are just taken. Every plate is not a hand-me-down. Some plates are traded and bought and sold. But that scapula bone, to me, was evidence of we can make our own things. We don't actually need to have everything from you. This is something, to me, it's that scapula bone with the hole, with the button near it that I'm like, well, not near it, it wasn't anywhere near it. But to me, even if it wasn't from that specific shoulder bone, it reminded me of the ways in which people are shaping and creating the materials that they need for everyday life. And so that, to me, is more precious than, a gem or a piece of, I don't know, a coin. The only coins we were finding were like pennies from 1950 or something. But, those kinds of things that I can tell that are shaped and changed and transformed to me are the most important artifacts or significant artifacts that I found in there.
Could you say a little bit about the politics of working for an organization like the Hermitage?
I'm afraid. it's a plantation museum in the home of country music. The visitorship is amazing. Not amazing, I mean, they have a high visitorship, and mostly from middle, upper class, white Americans from the Midwest and the South come there. Andrew Jackson is a hero. Andrew Jackson is the first common man president. Andrew Jackson is seen in many ways as an example of pulling yourself up from your bootstraps and making it all the way to the presidency. However, it took me years, but I did give tours, which we call the back of the mansion, beyond the mansion tours, where we talked specifically. We met the group outside of the mansion backyard, and we took them to the different sites, the archaeological sites on the tour, on the plantation. I talked just like I'm talking now, and I had a lot of interaction with the board, and I also worked through the language on the signs. That was important. There was no such, enslaved African American is a misnomer because folks were not citizens, so they were not American, so please take that African American off. It was those kinds of conversations that I went back and forth. I constantly had women from the Ladies Hermitage Association come on my tours and then bring their children and then bring their grandchildren, because I did talk, and the best questions I got on those tours were from children, actually, who don't know not to say things. But it was working, and I worked there for 7 years. So every summer I was there for 3 months. And I was probably the longest for a while. It was only me and like the head curator and one security guard that were there the longest. There was a lot of turnover from executive directors to marketing directors, et cetera. So I didn't mince what I did or didn't do, and I never felt that I was stifled from saying and interpreting the things that I said from the Ladies Hermitage Association or the board or the folks who ran the plantation. No.
I find this, for various reasons, absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, Monticello is a different, yeah. See, maybe it's because Jackson didn't keep, there's no papers, so, I don't know. I mean, I think Jackson is a different, it's a different space. I don't think, like Monticello is there's a certain expectation, there's a certain kind of folk that go to Monticello. I don't know. I never worked there, so I'm not gonna speculate. Different presidents, yeah.
You mentioned the Applicant Burial-Ground. I was wondering if you were a part of that, because I was in New York when that happened. And there was a lot of the seniors, the elderly, were really involved in that movement. People don't realize how much they really fought for that.
Yeah.
And a lot of them died 2-3 years later. And it was one that used that term all the time, captive African survival refugees. I was wondering if you ran into her. Her name was Elder Aduni?
No,
Elder
she was.
Oh, okay, Aduni. Because she used that word a lot.
Yeah. I wasn't. I was in Virginia when that. I mean, I knew what was happening because I'm a New Yorker, and some of my folks were out there, and then I knew Michael Blakey, and I actually knew some of the archaeologists, the all-white archaeology team. I knew some of them, and then I was really close with. Once they were doing the processing of the artifacts, I knew a lot of the archaeologists that were brought in to kind of process those artifacts. I stayed away from.
I think there was also a protest where they wanted more African Americans to be involved, and I remember that going on that
definitely,
too. And then there was a protest they wanted Elder Dooney. I know she did some of those struggles. We found it in her papers, and I knew it very well. And they even had to fight to have African American photographers.
Yeah.
And a lot of the people that fought in that struggle now, they're kind of like losing ground because a lot of people have moved on. But the museum is still there. Okay.
And again, the history of the way in which archaeological movements happen you have to research them. If you teach about the African burial ground, you have to kind of teach about all of those dimensions of it, because it was something that changed the way archaeology is done in this country. That burial ground changed the way everything was done.
And people don't realize a lot was going on.
Yeah.
It wasn't one incident. It wasn't one. It was a lot of events.
Yeah.
It was event after event after event. It was fight after fight after fight. I mean, it was amazing.
Yeah. And the truth is I believe after 9/11, the artifacts were in the World Trade Center.
Oh yeah, that's what I heard.
And in the sub-basement, and they survived.
Oh wow. Have you been to Weeksville in Brooklyn?
No.
Okay, I was just there over the weekend. They had an event there, which was interesting. And what was interesting about archiving, it was a Wikipedia edit-thon, and 2 days before, because I knew the woman who fought 25 years to make that happen, and I go to their Wikipedia article, and her name is not there. I said, how can you not? So I put her name there. Then I started an article about her, and I brought it to their attention. You didn't dig deep enough.
Yeah, yeah. See, that took archaeology.
I know you're talking about bringing your scholarship to the present. So I want to query you about the popularity of plantations for weddings, for all kinds of other, like, totally irrelevant, like, I would say kamikaze and circus-like detachment events that are planned there, and they're sought out, and it's very popular now. And then also the notion of the other burial grounds. There's one on 125th Street, way on the east side, that they just discovered. There was one in Virginia that became a gas station. Washington Square Park. Basically, all of this country is a, plantation archaeology site that has just been revamped. And then, if that's the case, then is there I don't know how to say it, but like a native indigenous archaeology praxis also happening that in parallel and in tandem, especially if you did mention Andrew Jackson? Just like at this point, America is just gonna go down in flames of like the truth.
And it was ironic, right? Because like I'm African American and I'm Eastern Band Cherokee, so my family was like, really? You at that dude's plantation? Like that's what that's not a good. So it's like double whammy. However, African American burial grounds, the protection of them. So an amazing archaeologist by the name of Mark Mack, who worked with Michael Blakey for years, who was killed in a car accident a couple years ago, which was extremely tragic. But he was based at Howard, and he was moving toward really pushing historical archaeologists to recognize African American burial grounds nationally and take it to Congress, and so that fell apart, and now it's being remobilized. So I think that, and there's now, look them up and like them on Twitter and Facebook. The Association of Black Archaeologists is actually, the Association of Black Archaeologists is doing some amazing things also with the shipwrecks of slavers, the ships that brought African people here, in St. Croix right now, and they have a site in Tanzania. And so what they're doing is they've gotten together. I'm a part of it. So, but I don't do underwater. But we've gotten the Association of Black Divers, as well as the Society for Black Archaeologists and the National Museum for African American History and Culture, National Geographic. So this stuff is like, literally, it's very low. You don't hear about it. It's like folks that are trying to get together, because if we're going to dig up a ship that tried to bring us here, the folks that are digging that up should be of African descent. Now, that could be controversial, but that's the way the Association of Black Divers feels. That's the way the Society for Black Archaeologists feel, because there's the material that is associated with that, we don't even understand the amount of ships that went down. It could change the way we understand the transplantation of the transfer of so many folks over here, you know, and that also incorporates the conversation with African divers and folks on the continent, because everybody, we're all kind of we're all kind of connected. I don't want to say by slavery, we're kind of connected by colonialism. There's a whole lot that happened on the continent in between the Caribbean and here, and in the global South, that we should be in conversation with. And it's a very slow moving process, because there are not a lot of Black archaeologists. So and Black archaeologists are often fighting just to be archaeologists. And it's an amazing thing to navigate. So, but there is a movement toward creating some kind of African American Graves and Protections Act. That's going to take a long time, because NAGPRA took a whole lot of blood, sweat, and tears to make that happen as well.
And what about for indigenous populations? Is there a movement to excavate with them as well?
To excavate with them?
Like to do the same thing that is being done with African Americans and plantations, it can be done on Native American and indigenous side.
Yes, so there are fewer indigenous archaeologists than there are Black archaeologists. So it's like, my good colleague, Soya Adalai is with me. She's Ojibwe, she's at UMass Amherst. And so like I wrote the book on Black Feminist Archaeology. She wrote the book on community-based indigenous archaeology, and like we're in the same building, so be careful. But yeah, so it's a very small growing number of indigenous archaeologists who are going to their communities and trying to figure out how to create a more indigenous, an indigenous archaeology that it's for and by communities. It's not just with communities. It's for and by communities, and it's challenging because it's not contained within the kind of the academic. Like when you write a dissertation, you should not my department's getting better, but you shouldn't take 50 years to, But with a community-based archaeology project, you might not be able to to firm it up and finish it in 5 years. It might not happen. So it's challenging. And what do you do to get the PhD and then go into the field and then engage with indigenous communities? So there's a lot of challenges to that. But yeah, there's a few of us. Go to the Whitney Plantation. That's like the only one. That one is outside of, that's in Louisiana. That one is actually, I haven't been there, but I don't know. There's always been a fascination with plantations. When I worked at the Hermitage, there was constant weddings going on. Constant. And some of them would ask for, we had a guy who dressed up as Andrew Jackson. I've seen it all. I've seen it all, but it's the idea of when things were. I mean, the idea, Confederates and hoop skirts and mint juleps on the back of the porch. That's something that's very well. It's alive, and in some places it's more lively right now. I think we're going to end on Confederates and.